this is joint work. The two-sentence summary of this paper is basically that we're trying to estimate the economic effects of this case, SAMR Alibaba, and we believe that we can draw some general inferences from the result that we have concerning this case and apply them to evaluate the normative aspects of Chinese antitrust enforcement. Okay, so the motivation for this paper is that there's this heated debate regarding the adequacy of antitrust enforcement in China, and effectively there are two camps. One camp errs on the side of under-enforcement. For example, Wang and Fang suggest that antitrust officials in China are promoted pursuant to metrics that measure the number of concluded settlements, and so there are strong incentives to bargain for overtly lenient sentences, even if litigation would give rise to socially optimal outcomes. Okay, so essentially the argument is that your incentives of the antitrust officials are based on settlements, so you just settle instead of going to court. Now, in contrast, Zhang, in her famous book, which I'm sure most of you have read, she argues that antitrust officials are incentivized to induce higher penalties so as to signal their competence to their colleagues in the private sector. Okay, so this is the career concerns hypothesis, which is basically based on the idea that if you are thinking about your future career as an antitrust official, you might want to signal that you are good at your job so that you can be hired as private counsel later. Now, all of these mechanisms are plausible in theory, but ultimately what prevails is an empirical question, and in order to answer empirical questions, we need to use empirical data to answer these questions. Okay. Now, in this article, we attempt to contribute to this debate by examining the effect of a landmark decision in Chinese antitrust law, the exclusive dealing case of SAMR v. Alibaba in 2021, through an event study methodology. Okay, so there are lots of flaws with this methodological approach. I will talk about some of the limitations of this approach later, but we believe that we are the first scholars to examine this study, or at least the effects of this case in the literature. Okay. Now, given its association with the largest antitrust fine ever imposed in China, the focus of this case mitigates some concerns associated with the possibility that the infringing firm might only derive a certain fraction of its revenue from the relevant market. Okay, this was well known in the scholarship from papers like McAfee and Williams, whereby they are saying that even if you have this event study methodology, you're not going to get a robust inference because most of the revenue that impacts the stock price is not coming from the antitrust market. Okay, because usually the firm produces a lot of products and then only one product is affected, so it just doesn't have that impact. Okay. Now, for us, on the other hand, we're looking at Alibaba, and the investigation concerns the e-commerce market, which we have from secondary sources concluded that this comprises a major fraction of Alibaba's revenue. So because of that, we believe that our motivation is pretty sound. Furthermore, relying on an anti-event study methodology enables us to overcome difficulties arising from the limited availability of data in Chinese antitrust enforcement. As you would know, in the law and econ literature, selection effects are a major problem because lots of cases are settled, so they are unobserved to the researcher. But for the actual cases they are litigated, the statistical power is often quite low because they are only a few cases. Right? Alexander presented some data this afternoon on the descriptive nature of Chinese antitrust enforcement, and you could see from that data that essentially what happens is that you don't have a lot of data to go on. Okay, so with this methodology, we can exploit the time duration, which we have very granular data on, even though we have a very small number of firms, and I'll go through some of these advantages later. Now, our article engages with three separate areas of scholarly research. I don't want to go too much into this because I don't think it's central to the paper. Okay, but I just included them for completeness. One area relates to the optimality of antitrust enforcement. So one of these areas concerns, whether or not there should be an optimal level of antitrust enforcement. Some of this stuff depends on what school you are in. If you're in the Chicago School of Antitrust Econ, then you kind of believe that you generally believe that over enforcement leads to chilling effects by discouraging behavior that would otherwise be pro-competitive. Okay, so usually this relates to behavior that concerns innovation, or if you if you are conducting some economic activity that has certain effects like encouraging relationship-specific investment. Now, on the other hand, of course, if you don't enforce antitrust law at all, we know that in general that's probably going to lead to wealth losses from higher markups. Higher markups result from high anti-competitive conduct, leading to welfare losses. Okay. Now, theoretically, the conduct of the firm is quite complicated because the profit maximizing firm will determine whether or not to undertake anti-competitive behavior, conditional on the strategies of its rival. Okay, so in a game theoretic setting, collusion involves a lot of different factors. For example, so we know that collusion is more likely in industries that have homogeneous products, and also industries that have similar cost structures, blah blah blah, right? In that case, then given that these industries have certain characteristics, antitrust enforcers might want to take that into account and focus their efforts on such industries. Okay, so it's kind of when you think of the whole general equilibrium concept, whereby you have to think about the objectives of the antitrust enforcers as well as the objectives of the firm, it gets quite complicated. All of this is to say that the theoretical story is quite difficult, right? It's quite involved. There's a lot of things going on in theory that could plausibly happen, and we don't know what we don't know until we get the data. So that's why we need empirical work. So some of these complications I've explained earlier. There's this political economy of bureaucrats. It's a topic I'm really interested in, but not at the stage of my career. For example, we know that officials in antitrust authorities may have their own personal objectives, and even those objectives might differ from the official objectives, right? So if you have state level bureaucrats, and then you have a federal system, the lower courts might have, the lower judges might have very different objectives from whatever that objectives that their higher courts might have. Okay, so this is a really complicated problem. Furthermore, in terms of individual conduct, where the firm engages in profit maximizing, they also think about other things other than the pecuniary sanction, like litigation costs, the loss of future profits, as well as reputational losses. Okay, so all of these things conflate the theoretical analysis. Now, what we can do is to suggest that our empirical findings may give rise to an inference as to the absence of unenforcement. And why do I say this? I say this because we don't know whether antitrust enforcement in China is overt, right? We don't know the X star. We don't know the socially optimal level of enforcement. What we can say is that the market reacts in a certain way to the investigation of the whole decision as a whole, and we can make some inferences on it. And we think that as a conservative measure, it's probably not the case that there's under-enforcement, right? So this is the kind of policy implication of our piece. Now, furthermore, we suggest that antitrust enforcement in China may be reliant on non-pecuniary sanctions, which is suggested by Zhang, as compared to conventional monetary penalties. So we don't think that the penalty itself, the money that the firm has to pay when an infringement is established, is that important. We think that other things that are going on, like reputational sanction and other non-pecuniary factors, play a much more important role. And when I say that they play an important role, it means that those things impact the firm's value, but the firm's value is not so much impacted by the fine itself. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about this later. All right, now the whole idea of this event study methodology is motivated by the idea that the net present discounted value of the firm's future cash flow is reflected in its stock price. Okay, so investors are rational based on the efficient market hypothesis. You price all available information into the stock price, and that represents a measure of the firm's future discounted cash flows. So if that's the case, we can harness events surrounding an antitrust investigation as a quasi-exogenous shock, right? So if we have an event at day X, we can use that as a kind of point to say, okay, let's take a look at how firm value changes in relation to other firms that are not subject to the investigation, right? So we already have this kind of setting whereby you have a control group and a treatment group. The treatment group is this firm that's subjected to the investigation, and the control group are the firms that are not. Now, this gets complicated, lots of problems. One problem is that, of course, the control set of firms, which is usually a basket of firms reflecting a market index, which are not subject to investigation, may have very different characteristics as compared to the firms subject to investigation. And we know that these characteristics might be closely related to abnormal returns. Okay, so we have thought about it, and we have actually introduced measures to account for these problems. There's also a lot of noise in determining whether or not an investigation event affects firm value, because lots of other things are happening at the same time. Okay, so can we safely draw a causal inference from that event in relation to the firm value? Maybe, maybe not, right? Depends on what other things are happening at the same time. Furthermore, we have a kind of small sample size because we're looking at a single firm event study. So the single firm is subject to antitrust investigation, and we know from Stat 101 that low sample size leads to low statistical power. So in order to address this, we take certain measures. One measure which we use is to harness the SQ test developed by Alibaba et al., which is a parametric test that basically corrects for the non-normality of abnormal returns. Okay, I'll explain a little bit of what this means later. It's a bit technical, but the point is we get around this problem of having a low sample size. The next thing that we use is to try to examine a basket of close competitors to Alibaba, and we'll talk a little bit about how we think about the closeness of competition, buttressed by other estimation strategies like that of synthetic control estimations. Okay, so the idea behind synthetic control is that we try to match, as what I suggested to Martin earlier, we try to match the firm that's most similar to Alibaba, okay, or has the most similar trend to Alibaba, with other firms that are competitors, and we correct for their differences. Okay, we correct for their differences. That's what we try to do. Okay, so the rest of the literature, I don't really want to go too much into this. This is more of, we know there are lots of Chinese antitrust experts in the room here, such as, we would know this literature, Wang and Fang, Zhang and San, Chen and Wang. Okay, there's a lot of debate. Some of this debate also relates to the fact that there was a public perception that the fine was too lenient. It was too lenient because 24% of the total turnover was imposed on Alibaba relative to the full sanction of the possibility of legal sanctions. Okay, so I believe that the full spectrum ranges up to 10%. So our article attempts to examine multiple events associated with the decision. So not just the financial penalty, but also all the other sub-events throughout the entire course of the litigation history, so as to provide a more holistic account of how Alibaba was impacted by the decision. Okay, so really the story is a narrative here. Throughout the entire history of the investigation, what exactly happened and how did that affect firm value? Not just Alibaba's firm value, but also the value of other firms. Okay, so we are looking at in kind of the entire industry as a whole and how they respond to the shock. Okay, so this is the whole idea of the paper. Okay, so a little bit about the background of Alibaba. Alibaba is a multinational technology conglomerate headquartered in Hangzhou, China. It offers B2B and B2C platforms like Taobao, Tmall, AliExpress, Lazada, both for the Chinese market as well as broader international markets. It is a firm that's listed on the NYSE as well as the Hong Kong Stock Exchange under the BAWA ticket and the 9988 ticket. The important thing to note is that it is not a dual listed entity, meaning that we are talking about the exact underlying same assets. So they are not separate, subsidiaries. They are incorporated in different countries. They are really, they are tracking the same underlying assets, and therefore the market price for any of the listings are representative of the investors' assessment of the same publicly traded company. This is important because when we talk about cumulative and non-returns for the New York Stock Exchange as well as for the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, we are really referring to the same stock. Okay, we're really referring to the same company. The only difference is that the market index use is different. Okay, so there are differences in the market index used for Hong Kong vis-a-vis New York, but you kind of get consistent results, so it almost serves as a kind of robustness check. Now, many of our empirical results will be centered on Hong Kong, and the reason why we do so is because we want to ameliorate concerns associated with the geography of investor attention. This Mengoli et al. Paper suggests that investors pay much closer attention to firms that are based in their home jurisdiction. Okay, and then they respond more to information shocks and so on and so forth, right? So we believe that this is a good theoretical motivation for a Hong Kong focused approach. All right, so a little bit about the history of the case. Now, among other events, this arose from a broader regulatory clampdown on platform companies in China. So in 10th November 2020, the SAMR released a draft of the anti-monopoly guidelines for the platform economy. On 11 December and 18 December, the agencies released statements calling for the strengthening of antitrust regulation and the prevention of disorderly expansion of capital. The reason why this is important is because they form the backdrop of the entire investigation, and we do robustness checks in testing for information leaks where we include these dates. Okay, so we included these dates and the results don't really change. Now, on 24 December 2020, this is the so-called investigation announcement. The SAMR announced, and this is important because when information is announced to the public hears of it and investors react, right? Investors react and therefore they react in a certain way, and they might think that if the investigation is not going to have much effect, they might respond in a muted way, or they might respond in a very substantial way by selling the stock if they think that it's going to be quite severe. So this related to Alibaba's exclusive dealing practices, practice colloquially termed as picking one from two. It's really an exclusive dealing case. Okay, Alibaba pressured sellers into offering their platforms only on its platform. At least that's what the complaints had alleged, effectively preventing them from listing similar items on rival platforms. Okay, now almost after 4 months, the SAMR issued a penalty decision. Okay, so they issued a fine. So here liability was established alongside with the financial penalty. It was held that Alibaba had imposed exclusive dealings vis-a-vis its merchants, assessing them on financial merits, and barring the highest performing merchants from operating on competing platforms. Right? So Alibaba would enforce such agreements, whether through written or informal means, by threatening firms with removal if they didn't comply. Okay, the reason why I'm kind of rushing through this is because I want to get to the exciting part, which are the results, right? Because much of this is just filler, okay, and it's just context for what happened. Okay, so we're only going to focus on two main events, which is the announcement of the investigation and the fine, right? So the rest of the stuff, we can leave it to robustness tests and Q&A if you want to discuss that, right? So all this stuff is filler, it's in the paper, but we're not going to discuss it because due to time constraints. Right, data. Where do we get our data? So in terms of the data, we have several things key items that we want to collect. The first thing relates to daily stock prices and returns of Alibaba, its competitors, and the market indices. So how do we determine the key competitors? We look at whether or not the competitors share the same GSCS industry code, and we narrow it down to the most granular level of the industry code that's required. Okay, so in this case, it's a 6-digit GSCS industry code. Okay, and this is motivated by the literature, Wallen Scott Morton. Now, in terms of other competitors, we look within that set of GSCS industry firms, and we select the competitors that have e-commerce platforms that are known by research assistants to be close to Alibaba. Okay, so like JD.com and Pinduoduo, right? We're not going to report Pinduoduo data here because it's in the appendix, and I think the JD.com data is kind of more comparable because it shares the same GSCS industry code as Alibaba. We also use crisp prices and Refinitiv Workspace. We conduct some checks just to see whether they're consistent, and we also collect data on gross profit margins. The reason why we believe that we need to do some tests concerning gross profit margins is because if you doubt that the net present value of the firm is captured within the stock price, and therefore the market capitalization is not an accurate reflection of the firm's value, then we will ameliorate your concerns by offering you another source of data. Okay, so this is another dependent variable, gross profit margins. And so we run some regressions matching the characteristics of Alibaba very closely to the characteristics of other firms. Okay, so that's what we do. We generally find, spoiler alert, we generally find that Alibaba did indeed suffer financial losses relative to its competitors. Okay, so that's our general story, which is that it's not as toothless as what some people think it is. Okay, so a little bit about the estimation strategy. Cumulative and normal returns are calculated in the standard way. The first thing we do is that we have an estimation window. This estimation window is 250 trading days before the event and 20 days before the event. Okay, so if we have an event like the announcement of the investigation, we have this estimation window that's minus 250, minus 270, minus 20, right? We have this estimation window. So from this estimation window, we run a normal regression of the returns against the market index. So this for Hong Kong, this would be the Hang Seng index. For NYC, we use a weighted index from Cripps, okay, which is the used by other scholarship. Now we estimate alpha and beta. Once we estimate alpha and beta, this is an estimated parameter. We substitute this into the second equation. Okay, then we use that to compute abnormal returns. So now we have a vector of abnormal returns. This abnormal return vector has a distribution. Okay, so we can for each firm I, in this case for Alibaba, we only have one firm. For each firm I, we have a vector of abnormal returns over time, and the cumulative abnormal returns relates to the fact that we add them all up. Okay, so we just add all the abnormal returns together, and then we have a scalar. Okay, so we just have a single value, and this value basically reflects an expectation as to whether or not this firm has abnormal returns over a very short period of time. Okay, so what we're talking about, very short period of time. We're talking about -1 + 1 days before and after the event, right? Or -3 + 3 days before and after the event. So we're talking about that short event window. Did Alibaba have normal returns around that window? Okay. So if we're talking about multiple firms, we're just taking an average, right? No rocket science here, just taking a normal average. In terms of the SQ test, again, I don't want to go into technical details. What we do is that we use the estimation the estimation window to estimate alpha and beta. Once we have alpha and beta, we can calculate another vector of estimated abnormal return, and then we rank all of these values from the lowest to the highest, and we see whether or not the 95th percentile of that ranked order is higher or lower than what we actually have, okay, or what we actually observe. Okay, this is a standard way to do a single firm event study. Okay, and then we reject the null hypothesis accordingly, if and only if the realized value is less than the actual normal return. Okay, results. Okay, so all of these stars are the stars relate to significance. If there are 3 stars, it means that it's significant 1% based on the SQ test. If there are 2 stars, it means it's significant at 5% level, and if it's 1 star, it's significant at 10% level. Now, when the announcement of the antitrust investigation was promulgated, we can see that on both stock exchanges, you had this large drop in firm value. Okay, and the one I like to look at is -11, because 0 is a bit noisy. So -11, -33, you can see that basically Alibaba had sharp drops in firm value. Okay, it's about 0.18. That's huge. Okay, that's 20%. There's a 20% drop in firm value when the investigation was announced. Now you might think that this is just a number, but it's not just a number, because when we look at EU investigations, we are looking at about 6%. Okay, 5%, 6%. When we're talking about US versus Microsoft, we're talking about similar figures, 7%, 8%. So this is huge. Okay, 18%, 20%. When I show you the graph, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So the penalty announcement is also very interesting, because here we have an increase in firm value. So that's very difficult to interpret economically, because when a penalty decision is announced, we would normally expect the firm value to go down, especially if it's larger than expected, right? So the fact that it's going up means that investors probably thought that the fine would be more severe, but it's not as severe. So essentially what happens is that you have this positive stock market reaction, which is really interesting, because in comparative studies across the United States and EU, what you have is actually the opposite. Okay, you will have this consistent negative sign, and it keeps going down, which means that the commission usually tends to impose a fine that's pretty severe, and so investors didn't expect this, and so the firm value drops when the penalty is announced. Okay, now as I said, the picture speaks 1,000 words. If you look at the dotted line over here, investigation, when the investigation happened, okay, so even if you account for current trends, there's this tremendous drop in market value when the investigation was announced. And of course, when a penalty was announced, it goes up a little bit more than market. I would say that we are running further tests on this, co-integration tests on this, to find out as to whether or not there's really any kind of significance in terms of the penalty. But for the investigation, we are pretty sure that this caused a severe drop in firm value, right? You can see this. Now, if you think that this is just random noise, I would probably say, okay, but let me show you another graph later that suggests that this was not the case for similar competitors. Okay, so when I show you the graph of JD.com, you will see that it's not like this. Okay, so this graph represents the time series for Alibaba, but that's not the case for JD.com. Okay, so here's a graph of abnormal returns against the so-called event window. Now, in terms of the abnormal returns, we can see that, well, when the investigation was announced, there was this sharp drop in firm value. But when the fine was announced, there was this large increase. Okay, so very strange. Again, in the EU and US, you have this negative dip, double dip, right? You have this dip when the investigation is announced, and you also have this dip when the fine is announced. Okay, so let's look at JD.com. And the reason why JD.com is interesting is because it shares the same GICS code as Alibaba, and it also is one of the key competitors as identified by our research assistants. So if you look at the results, you will see that when the announcement of the investigation was promulgated, okay, when this information was released to the public, there was no reaction, right? There was no reaction. Now, if this investigation were an industry-wide shock, meaning that if this were to hit the entire industry, if this were, some attack on technology firms in China, then we would expect that when the investigation hit, that all the firms sharing the same GSCS code or its closest competitor, JD.com, would have a negative CAR. But indeed, we don't see this, right? We don't see this. But instead, what we do see is that when the penalty was announced, then there's a negative market reaction for JD.com. And that's really strange, right? That's really strange because it means that, well, investors who invest in JD.com, they're supposed to, react to the fine in a positive way. If the fine basically, as Paul was mentioned earlier, raises rival costs. If the RRC story were true, then you would expect this to be positive. Okay, but instead it's negative. Okay, and we will talk a little bit about why. So I think we have quite a few interesting results just by looking at just the short-term CAR for JD.com and Alibaba. Okay, so this is the time series for JD.com. As you can see, in contrast to Alibaba, you do not have the similar trend when the investigation was announced. In fact, what we do see is that the time series for JD.com very closely tracks the HSI. Okay, so you can, in fact, as an econometrician would say, the time series seem to be co-integrated. When the announcement was, when the fine was announced, again, this could be just noise, but we actually don't see a positive reaction either, right? It just keeps going down. Okay, so overall, we think that these are quite interesting results that, although not very, my economist brain is screaming and saying that we can't draw too many inferences from these things. But at the same time, I think that there's a story to be said here, especially since this is the first study on the topic. If you look at JD.com's short-term CAR results, you can see that this is the zero line, right? So if it's on average below zero, it means that it's below. It's negative, but if it's above, it means it's positive. Okay, we see this positive return and negative outcome for JD.com. Okay, now very quickly, because my time is running out, we look at a lot of different variants. We look at the combined effect, and we find that if you discount this event below zero, Alibaba tends to suffer a lot more than JD.com. Okay, and in fact, if you look at the entire industry, it suffers way more, right? It suffers about a 7% fall in firm value to 13% fall in firm value as compared to its competitors, which range from about 6% to 10%, and of course, insignificant changes for a larger set of curves. Okay, so I'm going to skip long window returns. the synthetic control idea is that we want to try to match, again, we want to match a synthetic control whereby Alibaba is matched to all the other all its competitors based on the three threads. Okay, so if Alibaba stock was going down and its competitor stock was going up, we will use an econometric technique called synthetic control to try to match that, right? So we correct for pre-trends. So this correction of pre-trends is done by assigning a weight. Okay, I don't want to go into the technical details of the weight, but the weight is done artificially and then basically allows us to make a fair comparison. Okay, now the main thing to get from this table is that when you compare Alibaba vis-a-vis its industry competitors with or without JD, you can see that Alibaba always suffers a lower, a negative average treatment impact. Okay, so it means that the investigation really did have, or not the investigation, the overall decision really did have quite a large impact, negative impact on Alibaba. Okay, so here are some synthetic control graphs. You can see that this is the date where the investigation was announced. Okay, and it just keeps falling, and it just keeps falling. Okay, so to wrap up, I hope that I didn't exceed my time. We basically try to contribute to this debate by examining the landmark decision, and we find that this antitrust investigation was associated with negative stock response for Alibaba, but the short-term results don't seem to be similar for its competitors. If we use a long event horizon study, we find that the investigation is associated with a 19 to 25% fall in Alibaba stock returns. But if we do the same, we see that the fall is relatively muted for its e-commerce competitors. Now, when we adopt a very different approach and look at gross profit margins, use a synthetic control approach, we find that the investigation used a 9% decrease in Alibaba's gross profits. Okay, so now the dependent variable has changed. We're no longer looking at market capitalization. We're looking at gross profits. It's about 9% decrease. So overall, we think that, well, when you announce the investigation, that causes this huge drop in gross profits and market capitalization, which is consistent with what we see in the EU and US. But when the penalty is imposed, we don't see the same trend, right? So this is something quite interesting because we have new data to shed light on the issue. Again, I'm not a Chinese antitrust expert, but I let the data do my work, right? I let the data tell my story. Okay, thank you very much.